Need to check the names file carefully before writing. The names to avoid are Marcus, Diana, Tyler, Curtis, Fletcher, Nathan, Renata, Sandra, Gerald, Nick, Claire, Billy, Joel, Yvonne, Kevin, Petra, Owen, Brooke, Garrett, Holt, Raymond, Valerie, Cole, Patricia, Lynette, Warren, Conrad, Adrian, Derek, Dominic, Arthur Mead, Renee, Becca, Jade, Paul, Elaine, Brendan, Cassie, Rowan, Mitchell, Leonard, Stephen, Biscuit, Elliot, Simone, Caleb, Terrence, Walter Pruitt, Noah, Maisie, Sasha, Gwen, Penny, Hap, Grant, Lena, Theo, Harlow, Vivian, Foster, Douglas, Ray, Tuck, Gordon, Iris, Fiona, Hugh Aldous, Cliff, Dex, Beverly, Roger, Ray E, Fiona, Hugh Aldous, Cliff, Dex, Beverly, Roger. I'll use narrator. No name needed, first person. Girlfriend, Dana. Wait, Diana is taken, but Dana is not. Ex, Preston. Best friend, Wes. Others, Jolene, Chet. I made a mistake. Not the kind you shrug off over a beer with the guys. The kind that sits in your chest for months, quiet and heavy, like a stone you swallowed and forgot about until you bend down to tie your shoe one morning and suddenly can't breathe. I'm 51 years old. I work as a structural engineer, mostly bridges, some commercial. The job suits me. You design something that holds weight. You calculate the load. You don't guess. You don't hope. You measure. I've spent 26 years being the most reliable person in every room I've walked into, and somewhere along the way I confused being reliable with being chosen. Her name was Dana. We met at a fundraiser for the local library. She was laughing at something her friend said, and I remember thinking, not that she was beautiful, though she was. I remember thinking she looked like someone who enjoyed her life. I hadn't felt that way in a long time. My first marriage had ended quietly. No explosions, just two people who'd grown into strangers sharing a mortgage. Dana felt like the opposite of all that. She was warm and loud and full of opinions about everything. She'd call me on my lunch break, just to say she'd seen a dog wearing a raincoat and thought I should know. We were together for 3 years. Lived together for 2. Last spring, she told me she wanted to go to her college reunion. Tenure. I didn't think much of it. She went to school in Vermont, 4 hours away. She'd be gone Thursday to Sunday, sharing a house rental with a group of her old friends. I packed her a bag of those trail mix bars she likes for the drive, kissed her on the forehead, told her to have fun. She left on a Thursday morning. By Saturday evening, something felt off. I couldn't name it. She texted a few times. Short, cheerful, nothing unusual. But the calls had dried up. We usually talked before bed. Saturday came and went. No call. I told myself she was just busy, probably loud dinners and old stories and catching up. I went to bed at 11 and stared at the ceiling until 1 in the morning like an idiot. Sunday she came home early. I remember being surprised she wasn't supposed to be back until after dinner. She walked in, set her bag down by the door instead of taking it upstairs, and said she needed to talk. That phrase. Those 4 words. I've never once in my life heard those 4 words delivered with good news. She sat down on the couch. I sat in the chair across from her. She had this look on her face I hadn't seen before. Not sad exactly, more like someone working up the nerve to tell you your test results came back wrong. She told me she'd run into Preston at the reunion. Preston was her college boyfriend. They dated for 2 years junior and senior year. She'd mentioned him exactly twice in our relationship. Once to say they dated, once to say it ended because he'd taken a job on the West Coast. I'd filed him away in the category of person who existed before me, not relevant. I was wrong about that. She said they'd talked a lot over the weekend. Caught up. She said she'd felt something she hadn't expected to feel. I asked her what that meant. She said, and I want to get this right because the phrasing matters. She said, I think I need some space to figure out what I'm feeling. I think maybe we should take a step back. Maybe be more like friends for a while. Friends. I sat with that word for about 10 seconds. Then I said, Dana, we live together. She nodded like I'd said something complicated she was still processing. I asked her directly, Did something happen with Preston this weekend? She said not physically, but emotionally she felt a connection she needed to explore. She said she wasn't sure what she wanted. She said she hoped I'd understand. Here's the thing about being 51 and having already survived one marriage that dissolves slowly and painlessly. You develop a kind of clarity about these moments. I wasn't 25. I wasn't going to cry or beg or ask her what I did wrong. I felt something cold and very clear settle over me, the way the air changes right before a storm. I said, "Okay, just that." She blinked. She'd clearly expected more emotion, more pushback, more conversation. She said, "Okay." I said, "You want space. I understand. I'm going to give you exactly that." Then I stood up, walked to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and started mentally cataloging every practical thing that needed to happen next. That's the engineer brain. You can't stop it. When the emotional data doesn't compute, you switch to logistics. The house was mine. I'd owned it before we met, bought it after my divorce, fixed it up slowly over 5 years. She'd moved in 18 months ago. Her name was not on anything. That was not a choice I'd made strategically. It just hadn't come up yet. We talked vaguely about making it official someday. Now I was quietly grateful for that delay. She stayed on the couch while I thought. I could feel her watching me, waiting for the explosion or the tears of the negotiation. None of those came. I asked her one question. Is this actually about needing to think, or have you already decided? Long pause. I think, she said carefully. I want to see where things go with Preston. There it was. I nodded. I told her I appreciated her honesty. I told her I was going to need her to make arrangements to move her things out within the next 2 weeks. I told her I'd cover her half of the shared subscriptions through the end of the month, and then we'd cancel them. She started to cry. Not big dramatic sobs. Quiet tears. The kind that means someone is surprised by their own feelings. She said she didn't want to lose me completely. She said she hoped we could stay close. She said I was one of the most important people in her life. I said, I know you mean that, and I genuinely wish you well. But I'm not going to be your backup plan, Dana. She flinched at the word backup. I wasn't trying to be cruel. I was being accurate. The next few days were practical and strange. She had a key. She came by twice while I was at work to get clothes and things. She left a note each time, sweet, apologetic, full of phrases like, I'm so sorry, and you deserve so much. The notes felt like participation trophies. I threw them away without ceremony. My friend Wes found out about 3 days in. We've known each other since we were 22, worked our first job out of college in the same firm, stayed close through marriages and moves and all the ordinary disasters of adult life. He showed up unannounced on a Tuesday night with a six-pack and the expression of a man who has come to sit with someone in their foxhole. I told him the whole thing over the kitchen table. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, She came home early from the reunion to break up with you. That's not someone who was conflicted. That's someone who'd already made up their mind. I hadn't thought of it that way. But he was right. She'd come home Sunday 5 hours early, bag by the door instead of upstairs. She hadn't come home to think. She'd come home to deliver a decision. That landed differently. I'd been telling myself a generous version of events. She got confused by old feelings. She was being honest with me. At least she didn't lie. And all of that was technically true. But Wes's version was also true. And his was less comfortable. She hadn't struggled with this at all. 2 weeks passed. She cleared out the last of her things on a Saturday morning while I was at my sister Jolene's place for her daughter's birthday party. I told Dana the timing deliberately, not to avoid her, but because I didn't want to stand in my own living room watching her pack like a scene from a bad movie. When I came home, the closet was empty. The bathroom shelf had a gap where her things used to be. The kitchen had 2 fewer coffee mugs. I stood in the kitchen for a while. Then I ordered a pizza, watched 3 hours of a history documentary about Roman aqueducts, and went to bed at a reasonable hour. I want to be honest, I wasn't fine. I'm not going to perform stoicism I didn't feel. I missed her. I missed the version of my life that had included her. I've been making plans around her. Vague, future tense plans about traveling and maybe buying a bigger property and all the ordinary things people build when they think they're building something permanent. Those plans didn't disappear. They just became hypotheticals again, and that's its own specific kind of grief. But I also knew something I couldn't unknow. She had looked at what we had and looked at the idea of Preston and chosen the idea, not even the reality. The idea. She hadn't left me for someone she knew. She'd left me for a feeling from 10 years ago. You can't compete with nostalgia. You shouldn't try. About 6 weeks after she moved out, my coworker Chet, who knows everyone's business because he asks everyone questions and is somehow never annoying about it, told me he'd heard through someone that things with Preston hadn't exactly worked out. Apparently, the emotional connection from the reunion had cooled significantly when they tried to translate it into actual modern-day adult life. Preston lived in Seattle. Dana lived here. There was talk of visits. The visits hadn't materialized into anything. I filed that information away and didn't think much of it. Then, about 2 months after she'd moved out, she texted me. It was a Wednesday evening. I was reviewing load calculations for a pedestrian bridge project, which is exactly as unglamorous as it sounds. The text said, "Hey, I know this might be weird, but I've been thinking about you a lot. I think I made a mistake. Can we talk?" I read it twice. Then I put my phone face down on the desk and finished my calculations. That's not a metaphor. I literally finished the calculations first, partly because the deadline was real, partly because I needed a few minutes to feel what I actually felt instead of reacting to what I thought I should feel. What I felt, when I got honest with myself, was tired. Not angry, not tempted, just tired. I picked the phone back up and typed, "I'm glad you're doing okay. I don't think getting back together is something I'm open to. I genuinely hope things work out well for you." She replied within 2 minutes, "I don't expect anything. I just want to explain." I think I panicked. I got caught up in something that wasn't real and I threw away something that was. I read that a few times too. Here's what I didn't say. That I'd spent the last 2 months quietly rebuilding my life. That I'd signed up for a weekend wilderness course I'd been putting off for years. That I'd had dinner with a woman I met through Jolene. Nothing serious, just dinner. But it reminded me that there were still people in the world I hadn't met yet. That the house, which had felt echoey and too quiet for about 3 weeks, had started to feel like mine again in a way it hadn't since she moved in. That I'd gotten 7 hours of sleep consistently for the first time in years, which sounds like a small thing but isn't. I didn't say any of that. What I said was, "I believe you. And I'm sorry it didn't work out the way you hoped. But I think what you're looking for is reassurance that you're still important to me, and I can give you that without us getting back together. You're not a bad person, Dana. You just wanted something different. That's allowed. And so is this." She didn't reply for about an hour. "Then you're being very gracious." I wrote back, "I'm being honest. There's a difference." And that was mostly it. We texted a few more times over the following weeks. She was moving to a new apartment. There was some logistical thing about a streaming account we'd both forgotten. Nothing significant. The conversations were polite and brief and not unkind. The volume faded naturally, the way things do when they're over. I think about that week a lot, actually. Not with bitterness. The bitterness phase came and went faster than I expected. Maybe 3 or 4 weeks of it, low grade and manageable. I think about it the way you think about a construction project where something went wrong in the design phase, not with regret exactly, more with the specific interest of someone who wants to understand the failure point. The failure point, as best I can tell, wasn't anything I did. It wasn't the wrong partner or the wrong timing or insufficient effort on my part. The failure point was a gap between who I am and what she ultimately wanted, and neither of us had seen it clearly enough for long enough to address it before we were 2 years into sharing a home. That's not a comfortable conclusion. It's more comfortable to have someone to blame or to have a clear lesson learned. This didn't offer that. What it offered was just the plain fact that sometimes two people who genuinely like each other are not actually right for each other, and the longer you pretend otherwise, the harder the reckoning. I finished the pedestrian bridge project in November. It's a nice one. Cables and a slight curve, crosses a river in a county park about 40 miles from here. I went to the opening in the fall, stood on it for a while with my coffee and watched the water. There's something clarifying about standing on something you built and knowing it will hold. My sister Jolene asked me at Christmas if I was seeing anyone. I told her I'd been on a few dates, nothing serious. She gave me the look older sisters give you when they're deciding whether to say something. Then she said, You seem more like yourself than you've been in years." I told her I thought that was probably true. I'm not going to wrap this up with a lesson. I'm 51, and I've learned enough to know that life doesn't come with clean endings and transferable wisdom. What happened, happened. I loved someone. She left for a ghost of something she'd felt at 22. The ghost turned out to be exactly that. I rebuilt quietly and got on with it. The only thing I'd tell anyone who's sitting where I was sitting, in that chair across from the couch, watching someone deliver news that's going to change your whole floor plan, is this: don't negotiate for someone who's already decided. Not because it never works, but because you'll spend years wondering if you're the person they chose or just the person they settled for when the alternative didn't pan out. And that question is slow poison. It doesn't kill you fast, it just changes the taste of everything. I'd rather be alone and know exactly where I stand than be chosen by default and call it love. The pedestrian bridge is still there. I drove past the park last week. A kid was riding a bike across it with no hands, wobbling, laughing at something. It held. I've thought a lot about what actually happened in that living room. Not the words. The words were simple enough. I've thought about the mechanics of it, how a person can sit across from someone they've shared 2 years of their life with. Someone who knows how they take their coffee and what they sound like when they're trying not to laugh and still have already decided. Not wrestling with the decision. Already done. That's the part that took me a while to land on. Dana wasn't cruel. I want to be clear about that. She wasn't someone who set out to use me or discard me. She was someone who followed a feeling without thinking far enough ahead. The way you pull a thread on a sweater without considering the whole thing might unravel. The feeling was real. The consequence, she hadn't mapped out. And I think that's where the cause and effect becomes instructive. Not as punishment, not as some cosmic accounting system, but as plain logic. When you treat a solid thing carelessly, it doesn't wait around to be treated well again. It just becomes unavailable. That's not revenge. That's just how load-bearing things work. You ignore the integrity of a structure long enough, it doesn't collapse dramatically. It quietly stops being something you can stand on. What I didn't do, and this matters to me, was pretend to be okay with something I wasn't okay with. I didn't negotiate. I didn't ask her to stay while she figured out her feelings. A younger version of me might have. A less tired version. But there's a kind of hard-won clarity that comes from having already survived one relationship that ended in slow motion. And it's this: you cannot logic someone into wanting you. You cannot demonstrate your value loudly enough. Either someone knows what they have or they don't. And once they've shown you they don't, the most intelligent thing, not the easiest, the most intelligent, is to believe them. That's not coldness, that's self-respect, which is different. Coldness closes off. Self-respect just keeps you honest about what you're willing to accept. Wes said something to me that Tuesday night that I keep coming back to. He said, "You're not losing the person you thought she was. You're just finally seeing the person she actually is." I didn't like hearing that. But he was right, and the things Wes says that I don't like hearing are usually the ones worth keeping. The text she sent 2 months later. I think I made a mistake. I understood it. I didn't doubt she meant it. But meaning it and it being true are two different things. She made a choice with full information. The mistake wasn't an accident. It was a preference that turned out not to work the way she'd imagined. And I had already become someone else's version of my life by then. Quieter. More mine. I finished a bridge project. I slept well. I went to my niece's birthday party and ate too much cake and drove home in the dark with the windows down. These sound like small things. They aren't. The pedestrian bridge opened in the fall. I stood on it and drank my coffee and watched the water move. A kid rode across it on a bike, no hands laughing. It held. I built it to hold, and it held. That's all you can do, really. Build things correctly, maintain your integrity under load, and trust that the right weight will eventually find its way to you.